Hello again everybody. So this is the third video for the first session of esc10038, and in this final bit of the session I want to talk a bit about what the module is really all about. What are we getting at? What are the key points that we're heading towards, and to give you some new information regarding that. So the module is called the practice of physical geography, and it does pretty much what it says on the tin. We're looking at how physical geography is actually done, what it is to be a physical geographer, starting off inevitably with, well, what is physical geography, which a lot of you will think you already know, because we looked at that in one of our first semester modules as well. So the module aims to provide a foundation of knowledge about the nature of the discipline. I've put some headings on that slide there that you can look through and think about what we need to be thinking about. And as always with this video, as with the others, please pause it from time to time to take time to read over the slides, to take notes and to think about what we've said. You can work through these videos at your own pace. You don't have to work through them at my pace. So a lot of you will have been thinking about what is physical geography in your first semester modules, and will have made some definitions last semester. So maybe just go back and have a look at your notes, or cast your mind back and remember what you decided was your definition for physical geography, and what did I say in the lectures, and what did you find in your reading. And the titles of these couple of books that are relevant to this module indicate, of course, that definitions might change through time. The nature of the discipline changes. Our definitions of it depend on the time at which we're making those definitions. And that's something you need to be aware of, particularly when we think about the history of the discipline and how we've got to where we are right now. So what is physical geography? Well, last semester I said to a lot of you, and I'll repeat it now for those of you that heard me before, and I'll say it fresh for those of you that are thinking about this for the first time. We have to define geography, we have to define physical geography, both by the subject matter and by the approach that we take. We can't just define it by the subject matter, because we share that subject matter with other disciplines: geology, biology, history. Lots of different subjects are interested in rocks or volcanoes or plants and animals. Geography is interested in those topics, but it isn't the topics that make geography special, it's partly the approach. So you need to think about what is geography's, or what is physical geography's subject matter, but also what is physical geography's method or approach. And I would argue that the method or approach of physical geography is, broadly speaking, a scientific method. Physical geography is a science, but then more specifically, the geographical approach is the use of spatial evidence, or the use of evidence which is embodied within spatial information. So we're not just interested in where things are, but where things are and the patterns of things, the distributions of things and the movements of things through space. Those provide us with a lot of evidence, a lot of clues that we use in our particular way of doing science, of doing geography. So try coming up with your own definition of physical geography that involves both the subject matter, but also the approach that physical geographers use. And if you go online, not necessarily recommending these, but you can have a read through them in your own time, pause the video, have a read, check out some links, find some new ones by all means. But look at some online definitions of geography and see what you can find. Maybe go to some reputable, reliable sources such as the Royal Geographical Society, and they have their definition here. You can find that online and explore other definitions of that type online. And in doing so, just try and pull out some of the key terms. So this is our RGS IBG definition. And I've just pulled out some key items there: Earth's landscapes, places and environments, environmental processes, methods, an integrating perspective, applied problems, lots of areas of work, professions. There are lots of buzzwords, keywords, labels in there that you can pull out and think, right, yeah, that's what physical geography is all about. That's what I'm interested in. That's what I need to get to grips with. That's where I'm going. Professions, areas of work, applied problems. There's lots of interesting stuff in physical geography for us to get our teeth into. Now, that definition was actually geography, but I've chosen to focus on the things that are particularly relevant to physical geography. You can also go and do a search for physical geography definitions, both random internet sites by all means, but also then try and find some more reputable sources, reputable websites, books, journals, professional organizations, and see what they have to say as well. So for example, just look in the basic textbook and see if they either give you a definition of physical geography, or if you can create your own very clear definition of what you understand physical geography to be by looking at those reliable sources. That's something I'd like you to spend some time doing in association with this session if you haven't already done it, and we'll come back to that in the live sessions and at the end of the module. That is one of your goals for this module, is that you should be very clear on what you think physical geography is. And remember, what it is isn't just the subjects that it studies, it's the ways in which it studies those and the approach that physical geographers take. That all goes into making what physical geography is. So a couple of big points that I'd like you to think about during this course, and it would be a really good idea just to have a notebook or maybe a laptop next to you as you're doing this, and write down or type up some key points of your own notes. Don't just rely on the slides for your information. Rewrite the information from the slides. It'll get your brain to think about it. But a couple of key points that I want you to dwell on and keep coming back to during the module. First of all, the importance of scientific research to knowledge and understanding in physical geography. And secondly, the way that research in physical geography is organized and reported. And that's a good example of taking physical geography as an example of a professional scientific discipline. Let's look at how those scientific disciplines work in terms of the organization and reporting of the scientific research that is central to those disciplines. Now here's an example that some of you will know already. We often talk about physical geography as being a plural and contested discipline, by which we mean there are different ways of approaching it, different ways of doing it. People have different ideas. There are different answers often to the same question. That's plural. And contested, well, people argue about it. People have different opinions and they're presenting different evidence and they have different ideas, different ways of doing things. So physical geography is still very much a live fighting discipline where people have different ideas and they're arguing about those ideas, trying to approach a better and better understanding of the world around us. So a case study that a lot of you will already know about, drumlins, these glacial landforms, and there have been a number of different hypotheses as to how they're created: deposition by ice, erosion by subglacial megafloods, deformation of pre-existing subglacial debris, and different people. John Shaw, for example, was famous amongst other things for his views on how drumlins could be created by subglacial erosion, by huge floods of water underneath glaciers eroding the subglacial debris. Other people had different opinions, and there were very clear arguments about those in the scientific literature. So there are lots of case studies of that type that you can look at. If you're not already familiar with drumlins, then that will be that's the kind of classic example for a physical geographer to start with. Just looking at some of the different ideas that have been out there in the literature about the origin of drumlins and how those ideas have evolved over time towards a consensus at the present time about how the different ways in which drumlins can be created. Now, how would you report that controversy and that science? Well, it's going to depend on who you are. So imagine, well, you are a Kiel student, but imagine for a moment that you're writing an article for, say, the Journal of Quaternary Research, or JogMag, or Wikipedia, or the BBC News, or the Sun newspaper, or some other outlet. Think of a few outlets that you're maybe more familiar with, papers that you read, or sources of news that you use. How would you report that information about drumlins and the plural and contested nature of research on drumlins in those different sources? Now, I have actually kind of organized those resources into a sort of an order, and I've put you, as a Kiel student, put you fairly near the top there, where you belong, up in the professional end of what's going on. But imagine what you do at different levels in that hierarchy. Again, this might be somewhere that you want to pause the video and just try jotting down a sentence or two for something, well, from JQR or from the Sun or from one of your essays, and see how differently you might report that information. And there are lots of examples that you can find out there where people are talking about the same thing, but they're talking to different audiences. And because they're talking to different audiences and perhaps trying to not only communicate in different ways, but maybe trying to make a different point. Maybe they are trying to sell a point or sell a glass of beer, or maybe they are trying to sell information, or maybe they're trying to open up discussion. People write things for different reasons, and they write things to be understood and picked up by different audiences in different types of media. If you're preparing something for a TV advert, it'll be different from preparing something for a 50,000 word textbook. So relating this kind of example that you have there back to your drumlins or a physical geography example, think about the different ways in which you might report stuff. And just think about that whenever you look at any information that you take on board for this module or for any of your other modules. What are the differences between these different types of sources? Peer-reviewed science journals, something in the movies, your essays. Well, your essays should be up there at the top end with peer-reviewed science journals, in that you're using evidence which has been checked and you're trying to present information to increase knowledge and understanding. So the big test in there for the sources that you'll be using yourself and for your own work is actually up here in this peer-reviewed bit, which is a part of the scientific process where scientists check each other's work before it gets published. So as far as we can, we're only publishing, and therefore we're reading, work which has been checked and rechecked to be as good as it possibly can be at the time that it's being created. Now here's a little case study of how the different stages in that hierarchy, or the different levels in that hierarchy are connected in a way. And this is a case study of some science paper by Neil Glasser and Ted Scambo's 2008, looking at a structural glaciological analysis of the collapse of the Larsen B ice shelf. And this was published in the Journal of Glaciology. Now you don't need to go and read this in great detail. I'm not making a point here about the nature of ice shelves. I'm just making a point about the nature of science and other styles or other levels of communication. So this paper came out in the Journal of Glaciology in 2008, talking about an event that had happened a few years earlier, but the publication was 2008. Now this was important work, and in the journal there's an abstract. I'm not going to read through that, but I'd suggest you just pause the video here and just read through that abstract for yourselves and get a feel for what the scientists are focusing on and how they're communicating the information that they're interested in. So this is what the scientists have said, and they're saying, they're giving evidence, and they're then ending up saying what they think is the outcome of that information, that evidence that they've explored. Now you'll see, even without getting into too much detail, it's quite a complicated situation that they're explaining. There's lots going on in the natural environment that they're looking at, and they're arriving at a conclusion which is itself also complicated, in that they're saying several things are important here. It isn't just this one thing, it isn't just this other thing. There are several things that are combining to give us an outcome in terms of ice shelf collapse. So that was the abstract. Now let's have a look at a press release that was created to go to journalists so that they could write their articles in newspapers and magazines about this work. And a press release is normally a version of the abstract of the paper, or a version of the paper, which is just clarified and simplified a little bit to make it more accessible to a non-scientific audience, partly because the journalists themselves are likely to be non-science people, and also these journalists are then going to be writing something for a non-science, in many cases a non-science audience. So this, have a look, again, pause the video and have a look through this and see what's being picked up in the press release. I'll just draw your attention to this bit where one of the lead authors says ice shelf collapse is not as simple as we first thought. So that really is their key point. That's the point of the paper. This event that happened, well, look, there's actually a lot going on in here. It isn't straightforward. Now the next slide is then an actual newspaper or an actual media outlet picking up from that press release and then presenting the information to the public. And at this stage you can maybe pick out a few fundamental changes in the style of presentation, suddenly it becomes much more kind of sensational. They're experts and they're challenging a claim, and they've claimed that blah blah blah, and away we go. Now, buried away in there, yeah, they're saying climate change was not the only cause, but the whole look of this is very much attention grabbing and focusing on a point which is going to get people's attention. Climate change, not the cause. Experts challenge, claim. This is going to grab viewers in rather more than the abstract and the title. Like, yeah, that title in there, if they put that in the Daily Mail or on the BBC News website, that's not really going to grab in the readers as much as experts challenging a claim, and it's claiming that climate change was not doing something that everybody else always thought it was. And just for the sake of it, let's throw in some icebergs, because that's always a good one to get in, get the punters in as well. So it's interesting to look there at how different media are reporting science. And that's all part of this big, broad framework or context within which physical geography operates. We have the science, we have the public, we have the communication of science to the public. We have an academic structure. So you're involved in Bachelor of Arts or Bachelor of Science degrees, leading on maybe to Masters of Arts and Science. Maybe some of you will go on and do a PhD. There's this whole academic structure within the discipline. There's also a professional structure. The Royal Geographical Society with the Institute of British Geographers, for example, you can become a fellow of the Royal Geographical Society, you can become a chartered geographer. There's this professional route to qualification and professional status within the discipline, as well as an academic route to that position and status. And all of that is focused on research, publications, and teaching. Physical geography is a research-based discipline. We find stuff out by doing science. We publish that science, and that then becomes new knowledge, or at least provisional knowledge. And it's funded, for example, by government through the research councils. And that research, publishing, and teaching framework involves academic journals, research papers being published in those journals, review papers that summarize batches of these research papers, and then lower down the hierarchy, if you like, textbooks that summarize what's been appearing over the previous many years, in some cases, the previous years in journals and in papers. So when you're reading a textbook, you're reading second or often third hand stuff. If you read review and research papers, you're reading much closer to the original research, which is where you should be heading over the next couple of years. And all that is constrained by or operates within conventions such as the methods of science, this idea of peer review where people check each other's work. And for example, the house style, different academic journals or textbook publishers have their house styles in the same way that you as a geography or GGE student at Kiel, we have our house style that you're expected to follow. And within that scientific framework, these are the stages through which research in physical geography proceeds. Again, you might want to pause the video after I've just quickly run through this and just make sure that you're clear on this in your own mind. So within the context of some physical environment or some physical issue that we're worried about or interested in, we formulate a research question. We want to find something out. Why does this happen? What will happen if we do this? Where can we find the resources? What can we do about the hazards? Those are the kinds of questions that we might be asking. We then want to get an answer to that question, and we do that by designing some research. Now that in itself is a whole other set of stages and a whole other sequence that we'll talk about later on in this module. We'll come back to that one, but I'll shortcut it for now and say, okay, you design your research. You then put in a proposal to try and get some money to do this research. So you put it into the Natural Environment Research Council, for example, whoever it might be. At that stage, peer review kicks in. So if I write a grant to the NERC, the Natural Environment Research Council, they will then send it to other scientists to look at, and they will either say, wow, yes, this is a brilliant idea, this is a great research design for an important question, give him the money, or they might say, no, it's an important question, but his research design is faulty, or it's a rubbish question, and even though it's good research design, it's not worth tackling that question given the economic situation. There are all sorts of different responses that they might make, or they might send it back and say, great question, pretty good research design, but fix this, and then we'll have another look at it. So basically, there's a checking process where other scientists make a decision on whether or not the work should go ahead, and that determines whether or not you get the funding. If you don't, then you're back to square one. If you do, then you carry on and you do the research. And again, the research is a set of processes, a set of stages in itself. We'll come back to those later in the module. But having got through your research, you get to a conclusion, you get to an answer. Now, you might think, well, a conclusion is the answer. What do you mean, more questions? Well, typically, the conclusion to a piece of science isn't just an answer. It's an answer and some more questions as well. But when you get to that stage, you can start thinking about writing your paper and submitting it to a journal. And again, peer review kicks in. So after you write your paper, that gets checked. And if it's not up to scratch, it's going to be rejected or maybe sent back for revision. And when it is up to scratch, then it's accepted and it can get published. And those published peer-reviewed papers then reach the rest of the world and they have an impact, they generate responses. They are the new provisional knowledge on the basis of which we go back to the top of the diagram here, and those new papers, well, they're then the context within which we ask our next set of questions. And that's how research progresses through the system of physical geography. And that's the difference between journals that are peer-reviewed and sources that aren't. So things like Geomorphology, Quaternary Science Review, Sedimentology, Journal of Glaciology, these journals that we encourage you to use as part of the literature, they are peer-reviewed, they engage in that process. Other publications don't do that, and therefore they're not checked. They aren't as reliable as the publications that do have that peer review process. So I'm kind of running out of time, so I'll draw to a close. And where has that brought us? So my conclusion, and this is really the conclusion to the whole of session 1 for the practice of physical geography. Obviously, go and read the handbook, all that kind of stuff I said at the beginning. Make sure you know what's going on in the module and make sure you know what's what, make sure you understand the assessments and so on. But here's my conclusion to this first session. I'm going to put it out there and say there are good and bad, there are right and wrong ways of doing physical geography and of being a physical geographer. Now that in itself, maybe you might think that's controversial. We can come back and talk about this in tutorials and in our live sessions, but I'm just going to put that out there. Certainly there are better and worse ways of doing it in any particular context, but for now I'm just going to be black and white. I'm going to say there are right and wrong ways of doing it. Your job right now is to identify the characteristics of a good physical geographer, and you need to aspire to those characteristics in your own work and as you move forward through your degree. But the third point I want to make, and this is kind of the exciting one, is that, wow, yeah, it is exciting. There are genuinely unsolved questions, unanswered questions, unsolved problems in physical geography. We don't know everything about how the landscape has been created. We don't know what to do about all these problems. As I'm recording this lecture, there's flooding going on all around the country. There are landslides happening all over the world. There's all sorts of stuff going on in the world that we aren't able to fix or to work around. There's a huge area of work to be done by future physical geographers, and the exciting thing for you is that you are the future physical geographers.